Drew, I just don't know what to do with the iPad anymore. I mean, people everywhere are saying not to buy them. Craig, it's okay. It's okay. There are solutions out there, and I apologize for being so critical. You do? That's right, Craig, and I think there's definitely ways of making the iPad more worth it and justified for people out there, and I'm willing to help you figure out how to make the iPad worth it without releasing any new hardware. Well, how nice is that? Yeah, we're just talking software solutions today that should be pretty easy to implement. So, you think it's okay that the iPad 10 works with Apple Pencil Lightning? That's not what I said. One problem at a time, Craig. We're handling the iPad Pros today. Oh god, I'm such a failure. Yes, yes you are. Let's begin. I've thought about this a lot over the past year, and you guys have heard me talk about it, but in today's video, I'm going more on the positive side, because last couple videos, I've been pretty critical of the new iPads, and a lot of people's hate towards iPads, particularly when it comes to the Pros and them getting M2 chips and faster performance, all with software that really you can't do much with. I've come to the conclusion that the best possible solution is to bring macOS to the iPad, and I know there's a lot of people that disagree, and you're already writing your comments before listening to my argument. That's fine, I'm gonna downvote your comments before I even read them too, so it's a mutual disrespectful relationship we got going here. But here's the most common responses I get whenever I talk about bringing macOS to iPad, which a lot of people may say sounds crazy and Apple would never do, but Majin Buu, who has gotten many leaks right in the past, is already alluding to the concept that Apple may be working on a scaled down version of macOS to bring to the iPad. Now, I'm not stupid, as hard as it is to believe that, and I know that that's not proof of anything. That is not confirmation that macOS is coming to iPad. It could all be fake. There's all kinds of wrong rumors out there, especially surrounding the iPads. But even if there's a remote chance of it being true, today's video is meant to encourage Apple, yes, you should put macOS on iPad, at least the Pros. It's okay. It's not a bad idea, and I'll tell you exactly why. So, first common criticism. Well, Drew, if you just want a Mac, you should just buy a Mac. You don't need to buy an iPad expecting it to do Mac things. Okay, first of all, if you wanted a camera, you should have just bought a camera. If you wanted a pocketable music player, you should have just bought an iPod. If you wanted a cell phone, you should have just bought a cell phone. You see the problem here? Apple has made one of the most successful products of all time simply on the concept of making one device that can do what many devices do separately. Yes, there's typically compromises when you try to combine things, but my point is that the iPad could very simply run macOS and instantly enable it to do all of the things people keep asking for their iPad to do. Whether you want a calculator app, whether you want optimized battery charging, whether you want Xcode, Final Cut, Logic, all of the advantages of using a Mac, and that's a lot of the time why people don't justify spending that much money on iPads, could suddenly be justified if you now said, hey, now if there's any software feature that your Mac is capable of doing, the iPad can do as well. It's about combining features. Yes, there's compromises. Battery life may not be as good, and you'll probably have more smudges on the display, but the point is having a capable 2-in-1 that's running not just a really great tablet operating system, but also a really capable and great desktop operating system that powers all of Apple's most popular products like the MacBooks. Having that on one device so that you can take notes with your Apple Pencil, shoot your crazy studio videos with the ProRes camera on the back, but also open up Final Cut or write some software using Xcode or using terminal commands like you would on a Mac. All of those features can also be on one product. That way you don't have to carry around two separate products. For the same reason, we didn't like carrying around cameras and cell phones or iPods and cell phones. We liked those products all being built together, so it's okay if you want the iPad to take advantage of more functionality and practicality, just like our iPhones did. The next most common criticism I often hear is, well, Drew, iPads are supposed to be simple. Macs are for like the techie geeks of the world, and iPads are supposed to be for grandma. They're supposed to be for kids and classrooms, kids that aren't going to lose their USB-C to Lightning adapter, and kids that aren't going to lose their Apple Pencil 1 charge cap. No, they are responsible, right? Yeah, I understand the concept that because iPads are more affordable and used more by children, you want it to be simple and intuitive, which is why the suggestion I'm making in this video is not to abandon iPadOS and ditch it entirely. No, I still think iPads for tablet stuff are fine at, you know, the basics. Drawing, note-taking, media consumption apps, and schoolwork can be done with them. I'm saying iPadOS is still the default operating system when you open the box. It's just similar to how Apple was so comfortable with Boot Camp and dual booting on the Mac Mac, they could have a backdoor option for those real techie people. This is not for everyone. This is not a feature grandma would accidentally turn on. You go into settings, you go into software, you double tap the iPadOS button, I don't know, many times over, and inside that menu, it gives you an option to install macOS as a dual boot option, and you can switch back to iPadOS when you want to use it, and you can switch back to macOS when there's apps on there that you want to use. So you can bake it into settings and make it very hard to access. In fact, you can even paywall it for all I care. I'm not saying that every time someone unboxes an iPad, they have to decide which operating system they want to launch with. No, iPadOS can stay as the default. I'm just saying bake in a backdoor way, just like you baked in a backdoor way to launch Windows off of your Mac, which isn't even made by Apple. I'm suggesting an Apple-made operating system run on Apple-made hardware, which feels like that should be easier to digest, and yet a lot of people are still against it. Why was Apple comfortable with the concept of bringing Windows to Mac? Well, because they knew that there was some software in some applications that was not available on the Mac, so there was a dual boot way to let it run on the Mac. I don't see why that has to be so much different when you're spending thousands of dollars on an iPad Pro. The third most common criticism I also hear is macOS is not meant for touch, and for the record, I agree, but there's this funny thing called Sidecar, and when you use your iPad as an external monitor for your Mac, funny thing, the touchscreen doesn't work because they know macOS is meant for keyboard and trackpad support, which is why I'm perfectly fine with Apple saying in order to install macOS as a dual boot on your iPad, you have to have a keyboard and mouse connected. They have to ensure that the end user has a way to use it in Mac mode, because I truthfully don't think you need to reinvent macOS to be on the iPad. Just deactivate the touchscreen when it's in Mac mode, and then it will behave like literally every MacBook on the market. People get by with those not having touchscreens, and the iPad can utilize the touchscreen when necessary and ignore the touchscreen when that's not the most optimum view of input. I used to not believe this was a good solution until Apple started advertising nearly all iPads to come with a keyboard and a trackpad. You're in 2-in-1 territory at that point. You don't have to use the touchscreen anymore. You can use your iPad exclusively through the keyboard and trackpad now, just like you can a Mac. So why then is it so crazy to put macOS on the iPad in the first place? And again, if you're using like a drawing application, just like how Sidecar works now, the Apple Pencil can continue to work when you're using the iPad, even in Mac mode. But for regular finger input, no, it just ignores that. And if you want to go back to a touch-dominant operating system, just switch back to iPadOS. Not that complicated at the end of the day. You don't have to redesign all of the UI elements. Even though Majin Buu says that's what Apple is prepping for, I still am convinced this little backdoor option would instantly justify hundreds of thousands of people buying the $1,000 or $2,000 iPad Pro, because now it can do pretty much everything their Mac can do, at least software-wise. But then that brings another criticism up. The fourth one is that iPad simply doesn't have the hardware to run macOS. To which I ask, are you out of your freaking mind? They literally put an M2 chip in this thing. We had proof of a Mac Mini dev kit running macOS with an A12Z chip, which came from an iPad Pro from 2020. And now you're telling me this M2 chip that just launched, that they're putting in iPad Pros, that has Thunderbolt connectivity, just like a MacBook, that has a large 13-inch display, just like a MacBook, and mini LED on top of that. It has a battery, it's able to power that M2 chip, and you're saying it doesn't run macOS? I mean, yes, technically the batteries are smaller in the iPad Pros, so the battery life would probably be a bit worse, but hey, Apple doesn't care that much about battery life in iPads, right? If they did, they would probably enable optimized battery charging. The fact that they don't means that, okay, Apple has another reason to upsell you on getting a Mac instead of an iPad, because sure, maybe one day the iPad can run a version, maybe scaled down, of macOS, and you'll be like, hey, the battery life is not too good. Well, then you should have bought a Mac, I guess, if you wanted more battery life, but that does not mean the use case of an iPad running macOS is completely worthless, especially when there were hundreds of you, literally hundreds, commenting that, well, I don't care about Stage Manager coming to older iPad Pros because I just wanted external monitor support. So many of you were all arguing as to why iPad external monitor support was the most crucial feature and Stage Manager is pointless without it. So many of you are comfortable saying, well, yeah, I just want to use my iPad docked with an external monitor. In that case, battery life doesn't matter. It's going to be plugged into a monitor, probably getting power through that Thunderbolt port. So maybe Apple just says, hey, you can only have macOS on the iPad when it's plugged in and has juice. There's no way to boot into macOS on the go. Okay, that would be a little bit disappointing, but at least it would be a step in the right direction, because people could say, yeah, I use my iPad out in the field, I take notes in class, but then when I come home to my dorm or I come home to my apartment, then I dock it with the external monitor, boots into macOS, and boom, I can use a fully fledged Mac with the external monitor. Don't have to worry about battery life life because it's plugged in. But aside from that, like, the iPad has every single thing you need to run macOS and more, frankly. It's got Face ID, it's got 5G. Some people want to have cellular connectivity on their Macs. I don't get why, but you're still arguing with me in the comments about why cellular on the iPad is a great thing. If you could suddenly boot into macOS on the iPad Pro, now you have a Mac with cellular support. So there's all kinds of advantages to having one product that can do all of these things. And yes, absolutely, the iPad has all the hardware necessary. It has a keyboard, it has trackpad support, it has a display, it has a chip, it has a battery. It can do it. So these are all technical reasons as to why people argue the iPad is incapable of becoming a device that has the pleasure of running macOS. But these next two criticisms don't have to do with the capability. These come from people that say, yes, no, it's totally possible and it would be great, but it makes no financial sense for Apple to do so. Okay, now the Tim Cooks out there are really watching is like, yeah, that all sounds fantastic, but reason number 5, Apple doesn't want you to have an iPad that can do everything a Mac can, because Apple wants you to buy both a Mac and an iPad. They want you to buy both. And I'm here to tell you that weird techie people out there that are willing to buy, you know, the $1,200 iPad Pro, even though they're not really gonna do much with that M2 chip, it's just because, oh, that's the newer one. And the people that buy the 14-inch and 16-inch MacBook Pros, the techies out there are still gonna buy both. I don't think the iPad running macOS is gonna change that, because there's still a bunch of advantages to having a Mac. Like I just mentioned earlier, the Mac would have better battery life, the Mac would have a headphone jack, the Mac would have a full-size dedicated keyboard that doesn't age horribly like all the $350 keyboard cases do. You would get better thermals with the M1 Pro and M1 Max chip on the MacBook Pros. So really, the only Mac that you'd be competing with the M2 iPad Pro, because they're not putting the higher-end chips in the iPad, just the regular M series, is the M2 Air or M2 MacBook Pro. And guess what? Both of those things are cheaper and have a fair share of advantages over an iPad Pro running macOS. I mean, for one, they have way more ports to choose from, they have way better battery life than the iPad Pro would have, and they're technically cheaper when you think about it, because 13-inch iPad Pro is $1,100, couple that with the keyboard case, that's $350, and then partner that with an Apple Pencil, any type of storage upgrades you'd want, because by the way, both of those Macs that have the M2 chip start with 256 gigs of storage, whereas the iPad Pro starts with 128, which means if you want to really spec for spec match the iPad to the Macs, it's actually gonna cost more like $1,600 total compared to if you would have just bought a Mac in the first place. So I think the end result of the iPad Pro becoming less and less relevant and less people buying it, and that's why Apple continues to software restrict things to the iPad Pro. Like, we have proof now that you can bring the hover support on Apple Pencil 2 to older iPads. Apple is just choosing not to. Plus, they tried this whole shenanigans with Stage Manager and external monitor support only on the M1 iPads, right? And then down the road, they're like, actually, you know what? We found a way to put Stage Manager on the older iPad Pros, by the way. Whoops. They keep software locking things because they're running out of reasons to get people to buy those iPad Pros. Not enough people can justify that expense, so you know what the end result is? People either A, buy older iPads, certified refurbished, or secondhand, they find them for $500, $600, and you can get a decent 2018 or 2020 iPad Pro that still works for everything you care to use an iPad for, and then they buy a Mac for, you know, the actual heavy lifting stuff. And the second thing they do is either don't buy an iPad at all, or buy the cheapest iPad they can. They buy the iPad 9 because it covers the basics, it's only $300. $300 iPad, couple that with a $1,100, $1,200 MacBook, and the average consumer who's buying both of these things still ends up only spending about $1,500 on two products. Whereas if they would have just bought one iPad Pro that they knew would be their main 2-in-1 device that's running Final Cut or Xcode or Logic or has terminal commands and Apple Pencil support and everything, by the time they're speccing up the storage or maybe buying the 5G option or buying the Apple Pencil, they're spending more money than they would have if they would have bought an iPad and a MacBook separately. So no, I don't think the financial argument works either, because the extreme techies out there are still gonna buy both no matter what, because there's gonna be a chip or a reason to go with a 14-inch, 16-inch MacBook Pro. Plus they'll be like, ooh, shiny new iPad Pro, this is cool too. And then the non-techie people that are not spending that kind of money on their setups are still going to end up probably spending more on their iPad Pro setup than they would had they have just bought a MacBook and an iPad separately, because they're gonna go cheap on the iPad ultimately. And lastly is a criticism that I've kind of already brought up. It would cannibalize the Mac sales. If the iPad Pro had macOS, it would just sell so insanely good that Apple would move less inventory. And guess what? The iPhone cannibalized the iPod sales, but it didn't ultimately matter because the iPhone cost a lot more than than the iPod did. Same exact story with the iPads here. You can spec them out to go like $3,000, and with that whole product ecosystem, you're getting an M2 chip with no fan, not that great a battery life, a 13-inch mini LED display, whereas for less money or close to the same amount of money, you could get a full-on 16-inch MacBook Pro that has a way better chip, way better speaker system, way better battery life, larger display, more ports to work from. So even if iPad Pros had macOS on them, there would still be a huge reason and huge motivation to keep buying a MacBook if you don't need the note-taking capability, if you don't need an Apple Pencil, if you don't need a tablet in your life for Affinity Photo or Procreate or any of those things because you're comfortable enough using your Mac, the Mac is still going to be a better value. That's still going to be a better bang for your buck, and the iPad Pro getting macOS isn't going to take away anything from that. So, sorry, none of these criticisms that I get all the time really warrant Apple not bringing more functionality, more use cases to the iPad, because while the hardware has improved year over year and it keeps getting more and more crazy intense, now we're putting M1 and M2 chips in iPad Pros, the software has completely stagnated. It is just muted down to, oh, I guess you kind of have windowed multitasking. Oh, I guess you get DaVinci Resolve. Some other company can make Pro software, but they're leaving out a bunch of things from the desktop version of DaVinci because ultimately it's an iPad at the end of the day. And if Apple's worried about like side-loading apps through macOS or something, I would even be okay with the compromise of like the macOS version for the iPads doesn't let you download apps outside of the Mac App Store. You know, that would tick off a lot of people and a lot of people would be upset. But even if you were just restricted through the Mac App Store on the iPad, you would still gain a lot of functionality and you would still get a lot of things back between being able to write software for applications on the iOS App Store on your iPad. Plus, you could finally enable optimized battery charging. You could finally have a calculator app on your iPad. You'd get that Final Cut. You'd get that Logic. No, you won't have the same port selection as a MacBook, but for those who are willing to pay the premium to have one device capable of doing it all, they would be comfortable, I think, justifying that. And in the future, maybe Apple can scale up the iPad and we'll have an iPad Ultra or an iPad Max, and those can have more ports or better battery life or more screen real estate to work with. Maybe even find a way to put the Face ID sensors on the landscape side and have Apple Pencil 2 connectivity. That way you don't have to choose between your crappy keyboard designs, and you could have your function keys and Apple Pencil 2 on the same iPad. And yes, it would cost a lot. You know, they could justify that by saying, well, because it does more than a MacBook does, it's going to cost more than a MacBook does. It'll have thicker bezels than a MacBook and probably be more heavy overall. The speakers won't be facing you, so they won't sound quite as good. And there's reasons to still buy a Mac, but ultimately, I just want to see the iPad software catch up with the hardware, and individually adding all of these features to iPadOS. Like, let's wait, hopefully next year they do something cool with iPadOS. Wait, let's just see iPadOS get better. Yeah, it's been 12 years, they still don't have a calculator app, and all we got with iPadOS 16, unless you had an iPad Pro, is a weather app. That's it. That's your big iPadOS update. Well, let's just wait and see what happens. Yeah, no, that's gonna take way longer instead of just the shortcut method of going straight to dual boot macOS mode. And I think Craig has expressed that he's okay with shortcuts. I mean, I remember before macOS Ventura was unveiled, suggesting that I want to be able to use my iPhone camera as a webcam for my Mac. And I remember people in the comments saying, no, Drew, Apple would rather just let the webcam in the Mac get better. If they let the iPhone become the webcam, that's like admitting that Mac webcams aren't very good. And guess what? They did it. They were like, hey, you know what? We put a lot of work into this camera on the iPhone, and it's a lot better than what the Macs have, so let's make it an option for people to just easily use their phone as a webcam. And it works great, by the way. That's probably my favorite feature of macOS Ventura, because it was a shortcut route. Instead of saying, well, let's just wait 10 years and see if webcams get a lot better. Yeah, no, that was not a good solution. And I feel like that's what people are saying when they say, well, let's just wait a little bit longer. Maybe iPadOS will gain some more functionality in the next 12 years, as they don't even bother with a calculator app. So I think this is the most efficient way for Apple to maximize sales. Way more people would start buying iPad Pros if they were running macOS, and maybe they would sell less Macs, but they would be ultimately making more money. And that's ultimately, I think, what you want at the end of the day, Tim. I know you're watching this. This is your Apple Sheep here, and I'll see you all in the next one.